Welcome to Banyen Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyen.com. Since 1970, Banyen Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyen.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy.
Hello and welcome. My name is Jacob Thiele, the events manager for Banyen Books. This evening, we are delighted to host Jezmina von Thiele and Paulina Stevens on their new book, Secrets of Romani Fortune-Telling, Divining with Tarot, Palmistry, Tea Leaves, and more. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that although we have participants joining us from around the world, the physical location of Banyen Books is on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. If you enjoy today's event, we invite you to donate to Banyen Books to help support these programs to be free and accessible for all. There's a PayPal donation link in the video description below. Paulina and Jasmina welcome your questions. Please type questions into the chat box at any point during the event. Now for introductions. Jezmina von Thiele and Paulina Stevens are two voices at the heart of Romani fortune-telling and culture. Jezmina is a Sinti Romani fortune-teller, writer, and educator skilled in tarot, palmistry, and tea leaf reading. Along with offering divination services, Jasmina teaches classes on spiritual wellness and creative arts and performs poetry. Paulina Stevens, raised in a Romani American family, is a fortune teller and the subject of the Foretold podcast, which follows her personal journey as she navigates her community's traditions while carving her own path. Together, Jasmina and Paulina co-host the Romanistan podcast, which explores and celebrates Romani traditions. They're also co-authors of the new book, I'm going to bring it up on screen, Secrets of Romani Fortune-Telling, Divining with Tarot, Palmistry, Tea Leaves, and more. We're thrilled to have them both with us today. Please welcome Jezmina von Thiele and Paulina Stevens. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, we're so happy to be here, and Banyen is amazing. Thank you for that introduction. We really appreciate it. Yeah, so we're going to start by sharing a little bit about ourselves and the history of the Romani people and our experiences fortune telling, and a little bit of what that looks like day to day. And then we will read from our book and take some questions. I'm Jasmina, and I grew up in New Hampshire. And I'm currently offering tarot, palmistry, tea leaf reading virtually and in person. I love to do events, and I love to write and podcast with Paulina. Paulina, is there anything else you wanted to say for your intro?
Yeah, so I am Paulina, and I also co-host Romanistan podcast and co-author Secrets of Romani Fortune-Telling with Jez. Our main focus is activism, as well as lifting Romani people's voices, as well as just educating. I own a small private practice. I mainly operate online, but also in Southern California, and it is called Romani Holistic.
So we like to share a little bit of the history of the Romani people first. because a lot of people don't know that much about us, or even if you do, sometimes we have some new things to share. The word Roma refers to the Indian diasporic ethnic group. We're also known as gypsies, but gypsy can be a complicated word. It's been used as a racial slur, especially in the US. And it's one of those words that if you are not Romani, we recommend you don't use it unless you're explicitly invited to. It's not a word that you need to brand yourself with or appropriate in any way. But you might be familiar with the term gypped, for instance, which means to cheat like a gypsy. And there are other examples. Mostly the stereotypes associated with gypsies as magical conjurers, free-spirited wanderers, criminals, and in promiscuity as well. And we'll go into a little bit of where those stereotypes come from. But basically, around the 10th century in India, there were invading Ghaznavid Empire soldiers coming into northern India. And it's likely that the low caste Indians and maybe some African migrants, folks who are a little bit on the margins of society, were rounded up by the monarch basically to fight the invading army. And this war lasted for over a century. And the Indian army was allowed to bring their families to the battleground camps that were set up outside of the battlegrounds. And over that 100 years, an entire culture of people were born. And India lost that war. And thus began the displacement of this new culture of the early Roma. And it also seems that the Ghaznavid Empire captured a number of the Indian army. It seems that some of the army returned to India and some of the army moved west of their own accord. And so we have the early Roma coming into West Asia or the Middle East and slowly making their way into Europe in waves. And around the 1370s is likely when the first Roma arrived in Europe. We know a lot of this from linguists and historians. The Romani language is still about half Sanskrit, but also has influences from all the different countries that Romani people have been or settled over the years. And when arriving in the 1370s in Europe, it was the tail end of the Crusades. It was a lot of dark-skinned people speaking a foreign language, worshiping many gods. It went really badly. And the early Roma were enslaved for about 500 years in present-day Romania. And this is a very almost secretive kind of part of history. Even the Romanian school system doesn't teach this, even though Roma people were only emancipated in the mid-1800s. So that slave trade, or that period of slavery, was concurrent with the slave trade in the Americas. And a number of Romani people actually came to the Americas because of that slave trade. So Paulina's family has that history. And this is also something that is almost never discussed or written about or shared or taught. And if you'd like to know more about this, we have a few resources in our book. Margareta Matake is an amazing historian and academic who is working out of Harvard right now and has written quite a lot about that. And so anyway, we have this long period of slavery, and Romani people were only emancipated about 10 years before the emancipation in the US. And no reparations, nothing to, settle back into society. And even the Romani people who were not enslaved were met with a tremendous amount of hardship throughout Europe and West Asia, where they were traveling, where they were settling, multiple genocides, forced deportations, really extreme laws, even encouraging people to hunt Romani people for sport. And this has continued through the centuries. And we still have a human rights crisis present day. Romani people, especially in Europe, face employment, housing, education, health discrimination, and are disproportionately incarcerated and disproportionately impoverished. About 90% of Europe's Roma are impoverished. There are also a lot of human rights injustices in other places, including the Americas. It's just not as well documented. However, Margareta Matake with Harvard recently put out a study, I believe in 2020, a small study documenting Romani experiences in the US. And so that's something to check into if you're curious. And so throughout these centuries of persecution, Romani people were very resilient and adaptable. And our traditional work, metalworking, horse trading, performing, fortune telling, and a number of other things became our survival trades. And Paulina and I both come from fortune telling families. Our families also had some other trades, but we were raised to be fortune tellers, but in really different ways, in different contexts. And so to talk more about what that looks like present day, I'm going to let Paulina take over and share about what her experience was like.
So, also, I will let you guys know before I begin, sometimes we interrupt each other, or like
Yeah.
you guys may think that we're interrupting each other, but we kind of just talk over each other because that's just the way we talk.
And on the podcast too.
Yeah, exactly. But so I'll explain a little bit about my growing up and my experience with fortune telling. So I grew up in a closed community. So Romani communities have different subgroups. My subgroup came from Serbia. Half of my family came here late 1800s slave trade. The other half of my other side of my family came here around 1930s, 40s because the Holocaust basically. And then that's kind of how we got here. And because we were continuously kind of bullied, pushed out, not really accepted in society, and obviously a little bit like darker skinned throughout the time, we Roma come in all different colors and shapes. Like obviously I'm not that dark skinned now. And so there was a privilege where we were able to kind of hide and do different things. But fortune telling was something that, for one, it's our spiritual practice. So, um, in being a spiritual practice, we would also use it as a tool to survive, like, you know, those things that you mentioned before. So my family did do that. Like fortune telling was something we did do to survive. I was actually taken out of school at a young age. I rarely even actually went to elementary school. It's just something we didn't really trust. We didn't really trust the government due to all the persecution and non-acceptance that we received in the past. And and basically it just kind of continues now. It's hard for me to go like back into the deep history of why we still have these traditional practices, but they are still practiced. So I was taken out of school at a young age in order to prepare for marriage, as well as my fortune telling business professionally. That was actually really the only thing I was allowed to do, because we didn't really want to mix our culture with the rest of the world. We were afraid, or we still are afraid. Many communities still live this way in a closed community. And it was more of fortune telling, like I was told things like, well, we have to go on the street, we have to make money today or we can't eat. And you can bring tarot cards with you anywhere, you can read someone's palm anywhere. And so as we were traveling, escaping persecution, just trying to make it in the world, also something that we were just really used to doing throughout generations, yeah, it really was our job. We took it really seriously, and there's a really, really deep history into that. We've been doing that and popularizing it throughout over 1,000 years, or however long it's been. So I had an arranged marriage. I was engaged at 14. I was married at 17. I had 2 children. And I chose to leave my community. I felt like I wanted to pursue a higher education. I wanted to just kind of do different things with my life. I wanted to kind of date who I want, be who I want, dress who I want. I had to wear a head covering. And so there was just little things like that. And I took a break from fortune telling because I felt like, I had to do it. And I was like, let me try something else. And then I started like working on a computer, and like I had this kind of American corporate job, which I still actually dabble in, but my heart always came back to fortune telling. And I feel like I've just grown and changed in ways that I've adapted Western practices, like health, like food, ancient remedies that we've had in our family, and turned it into my own little program, basically, as well as educating people. And that's what we're truly passionate about. Jess and I both, like, we just want to educate people about our people. And I feel like even if we make a small impact, all of you people being here right now, that's the main goal. So yeah. And Jess grew up a little bit differently, but the similarities are insane. Like, it's just crazy how many similarities there are. So yeah, Jess, tell us about you.
So I grew up mixed and assimilated. So I grew up very assimilated into American culture, and my Romani lineage comes directly from my maternal grandmother. And so my grandmother came to America to marry an American soldier she had only just met, basically to escape the aftermath of World War II, during which she was hiding her ethnicity, which sounded very terrifying. She grew up without access to her language, without access to the Romani language, because she was in a kind of cultural hiding. And her family was housed by a German farmer in Bremerhaven. And so my grandmother grew up essentially pretending to be a normal German citizen, and in the midst of a really terrifying war where she knew that if anyone caught on to her, she and her family would be killed. And she described to me when she was a kid, anytime she was walking, if she heard a car pass, she would immediately jump in a ditch because she just didn't know who it was, and she was taught to be so on guard. And so my grandmother came to the US, and it would have been very easy for her not to pass on her culture, just to make her life easier. But she was actually really proud of her culture, and she did learn fortune telling and certain customs from her grandparents, who were also hiding, but in a different part of Germany. And she had this very almost like nostalgic feeling about like the Roma before the war, and it was just a part of her life and lineage that she wanted to preserve. And when she came to America, her American soldier husband was not great, and she was just really trying to protect her children as best as she could as an immigrant who didn't speak any English when she first got there. And so there was a lot that she didn't initially pass on to my mom and her siblings. They grew up with certain Romani traditions without knowing that they were Romani traditions, and she kind of taught them fortune telling, but without contextualizing why she was teaching them. But when I came around, by that time in their 20s, my grandmother had broken it to all her kids that they were Roma. And my mother and my aunt felt like that explained a lot. And my two uncles, who I also loved, were really very ashamed and very upset to find out. And their reaction really surprised her. And so she decided that when I came around as a little baby, she wanted to tell me right away, and she wanted me to feel proud of my heritage. And it occurred to her as well that if she didn't really pass on the family knowledge with more focus and intention, it was going to die out. And so I was really fortunate that she focused her attention on me. And she taught me fortune telling from a young age and explained that this was a job that our ancestors had done for centuries, and that I was encouraged to do anything I was interested in, and I was going to school, but this was work that would always be good for me. I could do it anywhere. I could always make a living in a pinch, no matter what was going on. But those times learning fortune telling with her, my grandmother spent a lot of time with me when I was a kid, it was my favorite part of my childhood, and she was one of my favorite people. And I was fortunate to have her up until last year. So her, and I'm 38, so I was really lucky to have her for a really long time. Um, and as I got older and went to school, it was something that I still always did. And I really just love the work, but I also understand that I have a lot of privilege in, being able to choose what I did and access education, and also choose where I was going to live and who I was going to marry. And so I always feel like it's really important to acknowledge too that my experiences with Romani culture um, also come from a point of view of assimilation. And so, neither of us speak for all Roma, but also all Romani people's experiences are different. Some people grow up in closed communities, and even other people who grow up in closed communities, not all of those communities are the same. And people who grow up assimilated have different degrees of connection to Romani culture as well. Um, yeah, so I think I would love to talk a little bit about our history of and connection to tarot in particular. Um, Paulina, you've said before that tarot is kind of your favorite practice. Do you want to share a little bit about why?
Yeah, so tarot, I feel like it's something that we've used just for so long. And I say we as in my family. And there was no real specific rules. Like as soon as we could talk, we needed to start like reading the cards, or reading the palm or whatever it is. And I do love palm readings. I just feel like they're a little bit vague. The cards have pictures on them, and we use sometimes we can use anything and we believe it in any way. Like if we're pulling up cards online, if we're pulling up cards somewhere, if there's a symbol in the card, the star, the moon, like we read it like in a symbolic way. And I feel like that is basically what transgresses into what we have today, is like this wide range of divinatory practices. But for me, I feel like they're just fun, and I always hate saying that tarot is my favorite form of divination because it is oversaturated today, and I feel like it's been heavily influenced by the West in ways that I wish it wasn't. um so yeah, and also there's also like, you get a card and then like you read the meanings online, and like that wasn't something for us, and it was more about focusing on the intuition. But it's always great too to like have that specific meaning on your mind, and I feel like it does resonate for sure. But realistically, it's something that I've been drawn to. I come back to it, and I think there's actually some parts that I talk about in the book that's basically that's basically about how I've had, tarot decks that have like 20 different decks mixed into one, and we're pulling out like four of the same cards, and like it's just super crazy, and they're burnt and they're full of stains, coffee stains, food stains, oil stains, candle wax, like, dirty as hell. Can I say that? And so yeah, that's kind of why it's my favorite form. But I love when you talk about the different forms of divination practices that people can use personally too.
Yeah, we really love to focus in the book about tarot, palmistry, tasseomancy, and we cover some other types of fortune telling too, scrying, trinket reading that Roma do. But we emphasize so much about how the kinds of exercises we learned as little kids, because can you imagine, teaching a 4-year-old how to meditate or how to tell fortune or interpret dreams? So we focus on the exercises that we did intuitively as children, or we were taught, to help our readers basically access types of divination that maybe they haven't tried before, or try it the Romani way. Because when Roma were arriving in Europe in the late 1300s, early 1400s, that was around the time tarot was being created. We think, Paulina and I personally believe that it's likely that Roma brought over some imagery from the Mamluk Empire, the Mamluk deck, which predated the tarot. It had cups, wands, coins, and swords. And even if Romani people didn't influence the imagery in the deck with some of those things, Roma were the first people to use tarot as a divination tool. It was originally a card game. And over the years, Roma have definitely been the people to popularize and shape the way that tarot is used. And, there are, there's a certain privilege, basically, with being a non-Romani fortune teller or any fortune or any spiritual worker who is maybe engaging with other people of color or marginalized people's spiritual practices that have been used for survival, because we're not the only people who have divination as a survival trade or forms of divination. There's a certain privilege that comes with it because you're avoiding the stigma. And so, Roma's forced nomadism because of persecution has been rebranded as, being flighty or wanderlust. Romani people being enslaved for so long, and especially women and children being considered property, created the necessity for Romani people, as they believed, to engage in arranged marriages, especially of young women, but also it led to the stereotypes of promiscuity of Romani people because of that property history. And also, criminality, Roma who have been forced into desperate situations in poverty. It's being overlooked, all the social issues that create these desperate circumstances. And then our magical stereotypes are really born of fortune telling as a survival trade. And so we have this issue where a lot of non-Romani fortune tellers might engage with those stereotypes or dress up as like the gypsy fortune teller, which is a kind of ripoff of Romani clothing, and be able to take that off at night. Whereas Romani people are still persecuted. The anti-fortune telling laws in the US were created specifically to persecute Romani people and other people of color practicing their spiritual trades. And so it's really important that we're really careful about the language that we use and how we engage with these practices, understanding that, at this point, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, even if they were a closed practice. Like, they've become mainstream. And so, we are really interested in teaching people how to engage with these practices respectfully, but also sharing about how we really do it, because you might have read divination or tarot books before that kind of vaguely mention, gypsies. By the way, that's a word that Paulina and I will use because we grew up using it, even though it's, not a word that we encourage non-Roma to use. So these references to gypsies, but not really explaining who we are or why we've influenced these practices so much. And so we're really hoping to both give voice to the Romani people. We've included quotes from many Romani practitioners and writers and artists. And we also wanted to teach people how to engage with it in a deeper way, in an intuitive way, in a spiritually interesting way, but also a more respectful way. Did you want to read a passage from the book, Paulina?
Why, yes. Thank you for asking. Okay.
Of course.
So before I get into it, when Jess and I first started this process in writing this book, we didn't really know exactly, we thought it was going to kind of be a guide. We actually kind of dabbled with adding, once we were done with the book, we felt like we wanted to even tweak the title a little bit and add in there not even just Secrets of Romani Fortune-Telling, but also surviving or thriving in a tough world. That's kind of what we came down to, because we felt like so much of our spiritual practice had a lot to do with just regular life lessons. If you don't want to be a reader, you can still look at the symbolism, you can still practice some of these things in business and in social relationships, just in work, just all these different things. So I'm going to read a chapter, not a whole chapter, but I'm going to read a couple pages. I'm going to read about 2 pages about how to be convincing. So this is chapter 10, and it is how to be convincing. The ability to be convincing transcends instruments like crystal balls and tarot cards. It's an art, a delicate balance of perception, communication, and presence. There are subtle yet impactful ways to authentically weave your divination without resorting to gimmicks or manipulation. You can be a talented, accurate reader and still be unconvincing if you don't have the right demeanor. Because so many Roma work this job as a survival trade, over the centuries we have perfected our presentation. Whether you're planning on reading professionally, just for friends, or just for friends, these tips will help you deliver a more powerful and resonant reading. Outside of readings, though, being convincing is a skill that will serve you everywhere. So this is me on being convincing. So Paulina on being convincing. Growing up, my family and I depended on fortune telling to make a living and survive. In my close community, it was one of the only professions women were allowed to work, and the only profession available to me. I'm actually going to pause really quick. We use a lot of like women, men, and things like that just because in my close community, it's just old fashioned and that's the way it was at the time, but we are very inclusive to everybody. So, yeah.
Yeah, anyone from any gender can do fortune telling, but Paulina and I were raised as women with no other gender options available to us.
Yes. Okay. So, yeah. So this was made clear to me early on in my childhood. Like many Romani kids in traditional communities, I was taken out of school in middle school because my family was preparing me to become a wife, mother, and fortune teller. I cover this in more detail in our podcast Romanistan and the Los Angeles Times podcast Foretold about leaving my community and arranged teen marriage. So you can guess the stakes were high and the game was on. It's not that we needed to convince people we could see the future, but we needed to convince them that we were masters in our craft and that they could depend on us for a raw, culturally rooted and truthful experience. With that said, predictions come true. And I'm going to say, okay, sorry, I said that wrong. With that said, yes, predictions come true, but I believe in the intuition that my ancestors and I possess. This book isn't just about any fortune telling, it's about Romani, or as I call it, gypsy fortune telling. We cannot afford to make mistakes or to make people feel uncomfortable. We never made clients feel like we were more or less than them. We just invited them in as equals with an open mind and heart. That's what was convincing. All the women in my family told me, you will never be you will never be a true success if you don't believe in what you are saying, whether it's good or bad. You have to convince yourself first, and most importantly, you have to believe in yourself and your craft. The elders would say, if you are not completely sure about something, you should say that. Express that you have a slight feeling of possibility about a prediction or statement, as opposed to telling the client you are certain when you are not. Honesty gains trust, and I cannot emphasize that enough. When I was 12 years old, I had already left school, and my mother told me I was ready to do my first professional reading. I grew up poor in my childhood years, and like I said earlier, our business was our livelihood. Before I met with my client, my mother told me that I better be convincing or we wouldn't eat that day. So, although you may not be able to put that immense pressure on yourself, you can indeed challenge yourself. For example, buy a new piece of clothing only if you successfully gave a reading that week. Of course, I wouldn't want you to stress, but I know working under pressure worked for me. It sounds a little unhealthy because it probably is, but you're not reading any old divination book, you're reading a Romani one. Romani people have experienced an extraordinary amount of cumulative trauma throughout centuries, and it's passed from our ancestors to us through stories, actions, and feelings. Now it comes up in our daily lives, our work, our books, and our hearts. So I believe it's important to note. My first reading went well though. I walked into our small office room and sat down with the new customer. My mother lingered behind me to cut in just in case I was doing a bad job. The worst part was the first 5 minutes or 5 seconds. I laid out the first set of cards face down, of course, because I was a kid and nervous as hell. My mom interrupted me and reminded me to flip the cards over so I could actually read them. The client chuckled a little with us after I finished, said that she enjoyed the reading. My mother and I still laugh about it today. Overall, you don't have to believe in yourself. Oh, no, sorry. Overall, you have to believe in yourself and meet yourself where you're at. You will make mistakes, but don't let the mistakes ruin the outcome. Shake it off. So yeah. Also, um, I have given readings before, just like kind of like for donation as a kid, or like palm readings, like since I was around 5 at fairs, festivals, and on the street. But this is my first one. My parents had a store, and so it was kind of like my first real like adult one-on-one client. So yeah.
Such a cute story.
Yeah. And so your turn.
So I'm going to read from the same chapter because I think it's interesting to juxtapose how our parents presented why it's important to be convincing. But we have a lot of different chapters. I was also thinking about maybe reading from the dream divination chapter and walking you through a little dream interpretation. But, I like to bookend Paulina. So Jasmina on being convincing. I had to be convincing from a young age, but for different reasons than Paulina. Some of my first clients were horses, and horses always know if you're nervous. And if you're nervous, then they're nervous. And the last thing you want to do is make a horse nervous. Let me explain. When my grandmother came to the US, she was already familiar with working with animals because of her stepfather, the farmer who protected her and her mother and siblings. Years later, when my grandmother and her husband moved to New Hampshire into a condemned house with barely any heat but a good amount of land, she wanted to rescue a couple of horses, even though they were extremely poor. She wanted to teach her children to ride, and she wanted them to teach the neighborhood kids to ride and make a little money using her old world skills. They made it work because they had no choice. My mom, auntie, and uncle started working as kids to put food on the table, and my mother and auntie continued working with horses into their adulthood. I grew up around horses, but was never a rider because my mother felt that I chose fortune-telling, so she refused to teach me to ride or even handle horses because I chose my path. My first jobs in rural New Hampshire, starting when I was a preteen and into my teen years, were fortune teller, dishwasher at a seedy restaurant, and eventually horse charmer. In the late 90s and early 2000s in New Hampshire, people were shy of anything that looked like witchcraft, so fortune telling wasn't in big demand. My mom and auntie could get me some gigs telling fortunes at their friends' parties, but not often enough for me to really master my work. If I was going to be successful, I needed more work with higher stakes. That's where the horses came in. The barn where my mom and aunt worked, or the people, people at the barns where my mom and aunt worked would balk at getting their own fortunes read, but were desperate to know why their prized horse was lame 3 weeks before the show for seemingly no reason. They would try anything, even a fortune teller kid. If you're a really good reader, you should be able to read a horse. That's the real test, my mother told me after she had arranged a few horse clients. Horses are harder to read because you don't share a common language. I would have to go off of pure energy. This would be great practice, and I was grateful, but I was a little afraid of horses. I didn't know how to handle them. Some of the horses were aggressive, unpredictable, and even violent, especially my first client, whom I called Bitey McKickerson. He was a 1,000-pound horse, and I was a 13-year-old kid who would be enclosed in his stall, trying to find out why he was terrorizing the barn hands. You can't be nervous, my mother said. If you're nervous, the horses won't trust you and they'll panic or worse. I couldn't help but feel like my mother was taking delight in this challenge. I had to have grit like her to pull it off. It wasn't all tea leaf reading and good vibes with grandma anymore. I had to have nerves of steel now. My first client, Spidey McKickerson, was grouchy in the mornings. He always bit the barn hands, kicked at any target, and was generally a nightmare when being let out into the paddock. My mother was not going to supervise me because this was the test. So before walking into that stall and closing the door behind me, trapping myself in the dark box with a huge animal who loved to chomp, I spent almost 15 minutes doing the cloud meditation my grandmother taught me, chapter 2, outside of his stall, clearing my mind and opening it to God, Sara Lakali, my spirit guides, my ancestors, and even Bitey himself. I asked for protection. I asked to do a good job because this horse was clearly unhappy about something, and I wanted to help him and everyone who worked with him. I looked at Bitey and said, I'm going to come into your stall now, if that's okay. I'm here to help you. He seemed all right with that, or at least indifferent, so I went in. When I stepped into that stall, I kept my breath slow and deep, despite the smell of urine and manure that I would never really get used to. The breath was my protective thread that would keep me calm, focused, and connected. I had to convince that horse that I knew what I was doing and that I belonged there so he wouldn't freak out and take a bite out of my face. I said, I'm going to put my hands on you if that's okay, but I didn't just say it. I imagined sending it to him telepathically too. My grandmother had taught me hands-on healing, so I placed my palms on him and asked if I could connect with him. Almost immediately, I heard a rushed voice inside my head say, they play the radio so loud and I don't like the music, and it hangs right in my stall and it drives me crazy all night, and I just get so tired and angry because I can't get any peace and it's way too loud and the bar hands are singing along in the morning and I can't take it. There was country music playing at all times in the barn, but I never thought about where it came from. I looked up and I saw that, yes, there was a small radio hanging at the top of his stall, small but loud. The way the horse talked to me wasn't really in English. It was more like my brain was translating his thoughts and emotions into my language. He was telling me that he'd heard better music before, and I understood that he meant classical. He didn't like country at all. I thanked him, petted him, and told him I would relay his message to everyone. I gave him some apples, carrots, and a peppermint, and he seemed much happier. When I told the barn hands and its owner what he said, they thought that was odd, but they did move the radio to the other side of the barn, lowered the volume, and said they wouldn't sing when they were near his stall. They even reluctantly promised to play classical music at night instead of their favorite country station. And Bitey McKickerson showed his gratitude by being a sweet angel in the morning from that point on. No biting, no kicking, no terrorizing. After word of Bitey's transformation got around the barn, my clients picked up and horses were telling me all their secrets. One was lame only because her shoes were bothering her. Her owner called the farrier who redid them, and she was back to her old self in time for her show. One skittish horse confessed that he was afraid of tarps, and that's why he was spooking in the arena, and so on and so on. To read for these horses, I had to be perfectly calm and confident, not just because they might get scared if I was scared, but because I had to really believe in my ability in order to get their messages and not think that I was crazy. Every time I believed in myself, I saw results and the horses were happy. I conquered my fear of horses and got some of the best practice I could ask for. My mother was right. If I could read for a horse, I could read anyone. I see now that my family was creating high stakes for me to learn quickly.
I love that story.
Oh, Bitey. I think of him often. So we're happy to take some questions now. Jacob, if you'd like to come back and moderate, feel free. But thank you so much for everyone for listening, or to everyone for listening. We really appreciate you being here.
Yes.
Thank you. Wow. I just want to say I was really struck in hearing both your stories of how serious and high stakes these initiations and the work is in this tradition.
Yeah.
So there's a really good question here from Victor Manuel. He has two questions actually. One is, has there been any good or accurate depiction of Romani people in pop culture or in some novel or any other work of fiction?
Well, there are a lot of Romani writers, and there are also Romani film producers. So I always like to remind people that we exist in those spheres. We've interviewed a lot of Romani writers on Romanistan podcasts: Rain Gagan, Frances Roberts Riley, Karen Gusloff Sumption. and loads of others are out there. And there's also a Romani film festival called Dikia, and that's held yearly, usually in Berlin. And so if you want really accurate depictions, go to the Romani people. But more recently, Paulina and I both reviewed the Netflix series Infamia or Infamy, which was a Polish Netflix series. And the depiction wasn't perfect, but they had Romani consultants and some actors. And it was definitely more accurate than things have been in the past. Paulina, do you want to share some that you feel like were not perfect? It's definitely not perfect.
Yeah,
But we do love the consultant who was on the show.
yeah, what is totally unfortunate is that a lot of like Romani, writers and filmmakers' work is really not mainstream and not in pop culture yet. But that Netflix series had many Romani actors in there, except the two like main characters. Like the main characters in there were not. They were just European people, and that was not so good. But at the same time, I think it's a great show to watch. And to be honest, even if it's not like totally accurate or the greatest thing, like we personally love it. And like you can cancel us, like I love Infamia. It was a great show. I felt connected to it. There are scenes where like this girl was going into arranged marriage, and her sister had left the community, and like there was too many like similarities. And yeah, I mean, there's some things that may not have been good about it. Like, of course, there was like crime that was brought into it, but there was also like some marginalized communities end up being more susceptible to crime. Like just little things like that happen. And so I feel like they did a good explanation on that to a degree. It's not the best, but check it out.
There's also a film called Housekeeping for Beginners that came out in 2023 with the Romani actress Alina Serban. And that is a really great film. And again, there was Romani representation in it, which I think makes all the difference. And we're also talking with Jacob just before we got hopped on about how much we all love the movie La Chodrom, which is like a musical documentary of the Romani people and the Romani diaspora from India into Spain. And so that's a great one, and you can get that on YouTube really easy. But yeah, I think look for Romani involvement.
There was Victor had another question, but I want to actually just maybe we'll get back to him hopefully, because I want to kind of be fair and get more people in there. So Susan asked, is astrology part of Romani fortune telling?
Well, Romani people come from India, and Vedic astrology influences palmistry. And there are Romani astrologers. How would you answer that, Paulina? Do you feel like it's part of Romani fortune telling? It's definitely a part of some Romani fortune telling.
So I'll just give like one example. I wish I could expertly answer it for you, but it's not as simple as like yes or no.
Yeah, it never is.
I will say that like so my parents owned stores, whether we were like living somewhere temporarily or going there, whatever it was. And we would collect tons and tons and tons of books and articles and pictures even of obviously a lot of old Indian divination practices, but also divination practices from around the world. And astrology was always something that I think my parents, my ancestors have practiced, although it wasn't something that I feel like it wasn't as like quick or easy to learn as the other practices that we do. I wouldn't say it's primarily a Romani practice, but I would say that it is heavily practiced in the community. I'll say that.
Yeah, and I didn't grow up with it being part of my traditional practice, but obviously it comes from many places and cultures or many different types of astrology. But I do know I knew Sasha Ravich is well versed in Vedic and other astrology, and so is Aurora Luna. So these are two Romani practitioners you could check out.
There's a question from Ilona. Can you talk a bit more about energy healing in Romani tradition?
Yeah, so the way I grew up with it, it was really like my grandmother started teaching me fortune telling because when I was 3, I like toddled up to her and put my hands on her knees, which were very arthritic. And she said I pulled the pain out of her knees and threw it across the room and then just marched off doing my 3-year-old thing. And she was like, "Oh, a natural. Great. We definitely have to teach Jez." And so my grandmother really just had me practice doing that more consciously. And she told me that when I take the sickness into my own body, because that's how I was raised to do it and how she talked about it, you have to then expel it. So when I was a kid, I just threw it across the room. But she was saying, you should go to a tree and work with a tree and have a relationship with the plants. And so they can take the pain or the sickness and basically recycle it into the earth. And I felt like the way my grandmother taught me, I was so young and it was just so intuitive that it was just like, yeah, you just do that. What was it like in your family, Paulina?
Energy healing, I feel like it ranged from a lot of superstition. So, like when we were going through a bad time or like gossip or sickness, like we'd cut our hair,
Mm.
or like if we were mourning, we weren't allowed to cut our hair or take a shower. Like we needed to like really like sink in with the mourning and the sadness and wear black. Like there was a lot of that, no makeup, like things like that. And in a weird way, maybe that doesn't sound like energy healing to other people, but for us, like those were our personal energy healing practices. And then the practice we would use to recommend to the outside world was usually a combination of things, a combination of like just our opinion and our intuition kind of guiding them, as well as tons of meditation, tons of chakra bowl. What else? I mean, aromatherapy was really big, like anointing oil. And we would actually kind of dabble. I think we even though like we would claim, sometimes my specific subgroup would claim that they were like Catholic or Christian or whatever they were, a lot of our practices were not. Like a lot of our practices were South Asian practices as well, Greek Orthodox practices. Like we had different things like that. But the energy healing, I think, also involved food and a lot of food remedies, basically.
Yeah, I love that as an explanation. But that's also definitely a part of energy healing. It's bigger than just like the laying of hands.
Totally. So yeah.
There's a question from, I think it's Dr. Hamed, if I'm reading that correctly, or Dri Hamed, maybe. Is there a Romani school of divinity? I don't know what that means.
No, you learn from grandma or I mean, there are Romani people who teach. And so maybe there are people who have their like, personal students in schools. Like for instance, Lisa Boswell in England is a Romani fortune teller. And I think she for a while had like an online school for herself, but it's not so organized as like you get certified at the gypsy school or whatever.
Is that something that you would want to see happen, or
Not
no?
particularly.
No. I'm
No.
like,
That-
yeah. Yeah,
Only when you want to. Maybe you'll change my mind.
maybe. I feel like I'm worried about it a little bit because I feel like I don't want people to be like, oh, like I, learned from the gypsy school. Now I'm a gypsy, because that's what
That's my
always
fear.
happens.
That's
Like
my
it
fear.
always happens. Yeah.
Right.
But I feel like I think it would be just interesting because I do like to teach classes and I do like to teach stuff about our specific practices that we learned. And so I feel maybe if there was just like a little program, maybe a little certification, but I feel like we would have to empath empathize,
Emphasis?
emphasize. Yeah, sorry. Like, what am I looking for? Emphasize that it is something we'd like people to honor, that it was our survival trait and we popularized it, and you know what I mean? Like we have a strong connection to it and it's a spiritual practice, because I think people go into these schools, and I think there's also like other divinatory schools, like in, you know, the Psychic Berkeley Institute and stuff like that, that I think are totally cool, but people say things like, well, it's hocus pocus, or it's this, or it's that. And I would hate to have it categorized as something like that, because it's like bashing, it's the same thing as bashing someone's, you know, spiritual practices and religion and traditions. And so I would like to see something, if it was done like 1,000% right, maybe.
I'm on board for that. Yeah, I would have a lot of caveats for it, but I'm all for Romani people, you know, making a living sharing cultural knowledge in the way that is helpful for all Roma, and not, obviously not stepping on closed practice, but just contextualizing what's already mainstream.
Yes.
It kind of ties in for me anyways. We were talking before about part of the reason why you named the podcast Romanistan is because it was connected to your not wanting the Romani people to have a state or a country. I was just curious your reason on that.
Yeah, so I mean, historically, the Romani people are not colonizers, and you know, so we just don't feel like we need a physical state in order to be considered a stateless nation. I mean, or maybe the better way to put it is that we don't need a physical state in order to be recognized as a nation. And it's really important to us that we are recognized as a stateless nation, so we have better representation in the UN and other organizations and entities like that. But for us, Romanistan is anywhere that Roma are, and we really make it an important part of our message that Roma of all walks of life are welcome in Romanistan. I'm queer and non-binary. You know, we have open doors, and we're also all over the world. Paulina, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think you pretty much got all the points. I feel like we call ourselves the outcasts of the outcasts. And so I feel like, yeah, there's that level of like we don't belong anywhere, specifically in the world, because we belong everywhere. And so we're still a community, we're still together. We just don't have a land, because all of our land is the land. The world is our oyster.
I love that.
We might have time for one or two more questions. We'll see. I thought this was an interesting question. What is meant by an accurate reader?
What is meant?
Yeah, I think Paulina, maybe you mentioned accurate reading or something, or accurate reader at some point when you were reading. So the question, I think, is what do you mean by, like, what would be an accurate reading?
So for me, I feel like an accurate reading is someone using their intuition as well as whatever, you know, divinatory tools or practices, like just kind of like doing what they want accurately. I also feel like the way I created, or not I created, but the way my ancestors created the divinatory practices was more as a guide. So although I believe predictions most definitely come true just because I've seen it happen, I also feel like there's a level of like logic that plays into it as well. Like you have to, people are coming to you that are vulnerable. And so an accurate reading is caring about someone, listening to someone, you know, using those spiritual calming practices, a meditation, a moment of silence before you start the reading, a couple of deep breaths, making them feel comfortable. Like, I feel like it has to do with that. And I'm actually knocking on wood because I'm also superstitious, but I have never had an issue where someone felt like their reading was inaccurate. Because I think, I mean, I really don't know. I think it's just because I think being authentic and being true to yourself, that's what I feel like is an accurate reading. Like not, um, just like not like lying or whatever like that, but being authentic. That's my version of it. I hope I can answer that. That was a great question. I have to even think about it more. I've never been asked that.
Yeah, I was struck by in your stories the sense that like the role that empathy plays in reading. It seems like with the horses, like you're really like connecting to the being and to their
Mhm.
person as much as it might be anything else. Like you're really just connecting and picking up information, I guess.
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
mm,
absolutely.
I will tell you it's an intimate practice, like whether it's an animal, whether it's a human, you're sitting with someone, whether it's online, over the phone, in person, there's a strong level of like intimacy and connection that's very instant. So we do talk about this in the book too, but we don't just get to like talk to someone or like a stranger, like go into something where we're talking to you and it's very deep, like there is no small talk. It doesn't exist, like, oh, your mom died, your relationship didn't work out, like you got this, you got that, like good things are happening, bad things are happening, like we want to know um what is really going on. And so we have to dive into that like ASAP, because I think that's what people are expecting. And so it makes it a really emotional, impactful, intimate experience, I would say. Yeah.
And I know we're at time, but I wonder if you'd be open to doing one more question, and a really nice one just
Sure.
came in. Yeah?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
this is from Heather. As a Romani adoptee, I have found myself only just discovering my heritage later in life. Romanistan podcast is a huge part of that.
Oh.
Yeah, do you have any advice for further learning for those of us who do not have family around us that share this cultural heritage as it would be appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, so we have a list of resources on romanistanpodcast.com, which you might have already checked out, Heather. Thank you so much for listening. I think that it can be really cool to go to Romani events, and a lot of them are online. Like I noticed Ariak has like a ton of free Romani like centered workshops where you can learn about history or art or all kinds of really cool things. And a lot of them are available on YouTube, even if you're not able to make it in person. And so I think go to into those spaces and just connect with people and share like what your interest is. Because I'm sure that you've heard lots of our listeners talk about, even if, for whatever reason, being removed from more money culture and then reconnecting. And I think that's really beautiful, and you have every right to connect as much as you want to. Paulina, do you have any more ideas or suggestions?
um I think, I mean, let me think. I don't know. I feel like you pretty much answered it.
Yeah, show up at stuff and introduce yourself and yeah, make some connections.
Yeah, we do have a lot of resources on there, but also my advice is kind of the opposite. Like be
Mhm,
careful in what you're looking into, like whether it's a web article, like who is it written by. There's
mhm.
there's a book called um should I even talk about that? Maybe it's a little controversial. There's a book called Secrets of Gypsy Fortune-Telling that was not written by a gypsy. And I feel like that's where it's like do your research a little bit more. Like there is stuff out there, but
Mhm.
I would just say let's um be a little bit careful. That's all.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both for this illuminating conversation on Romani culture and fortune telling. I wanted to let the audience know or remind everyone you can purchase the book, Secrets of Romani Fortune-Telling from Banyen Books. And definitely check out Romanistan podcast. Is there any other plugs or anything you got work that you want to share?
Keep up with us on social media. Romanistan Podcast on Instagram is where we're most active, but we're on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok a little bit. Because we are sharing other events that we're doing, classes that we teach. We'll be continuing to book tour, and we have a new project in the works that we can't announce now, but we'll be announcing. So keep up with us. And I have a newsletter on my website, jezminavontiele.com, and I do online readings as well as in-person events, and we love to talk at colleges. Feel free to invite us anywhere or other bookstores. And Paulina, do you want to share your info?
Yeah, so I have a private practice called romaniholistic.com, and I also offer wellness plans. So these are spiritual wellness plans, but they also incorporate like diet, meditation, and life coaching. So that's one thing that I do. And I also want to emphasize listening to our podcast in order to hear the stories and information. It's funny, it's dark sometimes, it's spooky, like it's traumatic. I don't know. Like and we talk to a real good amount of people. And I feel like I'd love for you guys to just kind of hear everybody's stories, all the people that we interview. They have such different, unique situations. And so yeah.
Super. Well, thank you so much, everybody, and for coming out, and thank you both, Jezmina and Paulina.
Thank you so much for having us. This was wonderful.
We are honored.
Yes.
So, yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyen Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyen Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyen.com.